Hi, welcome to America Uncovered. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Asian Americans, such an incredibly diverse group of people. Chinese, Indian, Hmong, Cambodian, Bangladeshi. There are 23 countries in what most people think of as Asia. That doesn't even include the Middle East, Central Asia, or that giant part of Russia that everyone forgets about. Oh, and as if Asians weren't diverse enough, we throw Pacific Islanders in with them because where else are they going to go? They're stuck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So the question is, how can we lump these people all together to check off a box on a form? But wait, I know what all Asian Americans have in common. They're not nearly as likable as other ethnicities. No, that's not me saying that. That's what Harvard University says, according to a lawsuit. Harvard consistently rated Asian American applicants lower than others on traits like positive personality, likability, courage, kindness, and being widely respected. Those are allegations in a lawsuit filed against Harvard in 2015 by a coalition of more than 60 Asian American groups. They're now being represented by Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA. The group largely focuses on Asian Americans, and it's headed by Edward Blum, a staunch opponent of affirmative action policies. The lawsuit alleges Harvard University discriminates against Asian Americans in admission practices, that it's basically affirmative action gone wrong. Asian Americans as a whole are more likely to have higher test scores, better grades, and more extracurricular activities. But despite that, they have a tougher time gaining access to an Ivy League education, which, if you think about it, just perpetuates the problem in a never-ending cycle of tiger moms. Harvard has admitted that in a 2013 internal review, if Harvard considered only academic achievement, the Asian American share of the class would rise to 43% from the actual 19%. Now that would be similar to numbers at universities like the California Institute of Technology or the University of California, where admission is based strictly on academics. The SFFA adds to their lawsuit claim, an Asian American male applicant with a 25% chance of admission would have a 35% chance if he were white, 75% chance if he were Hispanic, and 95% chance if he were black. But despite the findings of Harvard's 2013 internal review, instead of taking even the most minor steps to address this problem or conducting any further investigation, Harvard killed the investigation and buried the reports, according to SFFA. In fact, Harvard has a history of discrimination against Asian Americans. Asians weren't even recognized as a minority group until 1976, the same year the school refused to admit 2 Chinese women to a freshman minority orientation banquet. The SFFA compares Harvard's treatment of Asian Americans with its well-documented campaign to reduce the growing number of Jews being admitted to Harvard in the 1920s. Back then, Harvard didn't want a blatant quota system since it could generate bad publicity. Instead, they used vague, subjective criteria based on character, personality, and promise. The court documents call Harvard's discrimination against Jews the original sin of holistic admissions, which is a term for accepting students based on qualities that can't be measured. What's that, Shelley? Harvard sucks, and who would want to go there anyway? You got rejected from Harvard, didn't you? Okay, I won't tell your parents. The point is, Harvard, like many universities, has a bad history of racial discrimination, but attempts to address that discrimination have also been controversial. Race quotas were ruled unconstitutional in a 1978 Supreme Court case. But in a 2003 case, the Supreme Court established that student diversity has inherent value. And in a 2016 case, the Supreme Court ruled that considerable deference is owed to a university in defining those intangible characteristics, like student body diversity, that are central to its identity and educational mission. Effectively, these Supreme Court decisions mean that race can be used as one factor among many to promote student body diversity. So while having quotas for race is illegal, you can use other methods to get more students of a certain race, as long as these methods are not based only on race. And really, is it Harvard's fault if Asians just don't have positive personalities? And if you think all that sounds complicated and vague in ways that can easily lead to unfairness, you would be right. Statistically, in the U.S., Asian Americans outperform blacks, Latinos, and whites in high school grades and on SATs. So under policies like Harvard's, it's disproportionately harder for Asian Americans to be granted admission. And this can be even more unfair for some Asian Americans, because while lots of Chinese American students make it into top universities, a lot fewer Laotian, Cambodian, and Hmong students do. They're even less represented in universities than blacks and often come from poorer backgrounds. But for admissions purposes, all Asians get lumped together in a single group. And that's what they get for coming from the largest landmass in the world. If only Pangaea had broken up into smaller pieces. One Princeton University study looked at how much advantage and disadvantage each broad racial group has when applying to elite universities. It found that the bonus for African American applicants is roughly equivalent to an extra 230 SAT points and 185 points for Hispanics, but the Asian disadvantage is comparable to a loss of 50 SAT points. Which means that on average, an Asian American would need to score 50 SAT points higher than a white person and a whopping 280 points higher than a black person to get merely an equal shot at being admitted. Wait a minute. Asian Americans effectively get a 50-point penalty on the SATs? I think that means that I actually scored higher on the SATs than Shelley. Yes! Here's a different Princeton study on affirmative action. It's called Ending Affirmative Action Would Devastate Most Minority College Enrollment. Sounds like ending affirmative action would be bad for minority students, right? Well, according to the study, it would result in sharp declines in the number of African Americans and Hispanics accepted, with little gain for white students. But Asian students would fill nearly 4 out of every 5 places in the admitted class not taken by African American and Hispanic students. So in a way, affirmative action sounds like it's become a form of institutionalized racism where the biggest victims are Asian Americans. So what has been the response to the lawsuit against Harvard, the one brought by Students for Fair Admissions? Well, Harvard has denied wrongdoing. It defended the right of universities to use race as a factor in college admissions. Others were quick to defend Harvard, saying this whole thing is a plot by Edward Blum and the Trump administration to promote a racist agenda. This brief in support of Harvard from students and alumni condemns the ones suing Harvard for their attempt to manufacture conflict between racial and ethnic groups in order to revive an unrelenting agenda to dismantle efforts to create a racially diverse and inclusive student body through college admissions. Jeannie Park, the head of the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance and co-founder of the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard, said, "It's alarming that Trump is aligning himself with anti-civil rights activist Edward Blum in this subversive attempt to say that civil rights protections cause discrimination. Trump does not speak for Asian Americans, just as Blum does not." Vox says this is a case of the racial mascoting of Asians by whites to eliminate affirmative action. But SFFA says it has no intention of promoting a pro-white agenda, especially since white applicants would be most hurt if Asian American admissions rose. In other words, the Trump administration is being accused of racism for pushing universities to ignore race, even though this move would actually hurt white applicants. So you might be wondering, how is the Trump administration involved in all this? Well, the Justice Department, which is part of the executive branch, released this statement of interest about the case. It says, Harvard's race-based admission process significantly disadvantages Asian American applicants compared to applicants of other racial groups, including both white applicants and applicants from other racial minority groups. It goes on to say, Harvard gets millions of taxpayer dollars every year, so the case really should at least be heard in court instead of dismissed before trial like Harvard wants. That could mean the case eventually goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, just like many affirmative action-related cases have over the last 40 years. And by that point, the Supreme Court will have at least 2 justices appointed by Trump. And depending on how the Supreme Court rules, that could change the way colleges and universities across the country look at affirmative action forever. This is not the first time the Trump administration has been accused of setting its sights on affirmative action. In July, the Education and Justice Department reversed Obama-era guidelines on affirmative action. They said those Obama-era guidelines went beyond what was called for in the Constitution. Then in August, the New York Times reported the Department of Justice was redirecting resources to investigate and sue universities over affirmative action policies that discriminate against whites. Although, as it turns out, that New York Times report had a major error. The Justice Department corrected them, saying, no, the investigation was on the Harvard case about discrimination against Asian Americans, not whites. So, how did this whole affirmative action thing get started? Affirmative action began in 1961 in an executive order by President John F. Kennedy. It called on government contractors to, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. In other words, under President Kennedy, affirmative action meant being blind to race. But then in 1969, President Richard Nixon issued the revised Philadelphia Plan. It called on requiring government contractors to, quote, take affirmative action to hire minority workers as a way to compensate for the injustices minorities often faced when they applied for jobs. Bet you don't think of Nixon promoting affirmative action. Anyway, as time went on, affirmative action evolved to not just compensate for the disadvantages minorities may face presently, but also to compensate for the historical injustices that minorities have faced in the past. But redressing historical injustices can be dicey, especially considering that Chinese also faced serious discrimination in the U.S., including the Chinese Exclusion Act, which didn't effectively end until 1965, the same era as the Civil Rights Movement. But today, Chinese Americans significantly outperform whites in school, so affirmative action is not helping them. So there's a wide range of views on affirmative action. Some say it was necessary once, but there's been so much progress in 50 years, it's no longer necessary. Others say we still need it because admissions and hiring are still unequal across races. Still others say that the way affirmative action is being implemented has turned it into a form of systemic racism against Asian Americans. And yet others say white people are using so-called discrimination of Asian Americans to justify destroying affirmative action and oppressing other minorities. The most recent Supreme Court case decision in 2016 on affirmative action was split 4-3. And the court said that that particular case was unique, and their decision to uphold the University of Texas's admission policy did not mean that all affirmative action policies were constitutional. In fact, they said that it remains an enduring challenge to our nation's education system to reconcile the pursuit of diversity with the constitutional promise of equal treatment and dignity. So if the Harvard lawsuit makes it to the Supreme Court, it could be an interesting case to follow. So what do you think about the lawsuit against Harvard? Leave your comments below. And before you go, creating a show with this level of research isn't easy. That's why Shelley, Matt, and I rely on viewer support to buy coffee so we can keep making the show. Precious, precious coffee. So join us by going to our crowdfunding website Patreon and contributing $1 or more per episode. As a way of saying thanks, you'll get to have a say in what future episodes we make. So head over to patreon.com/AmericaUncovered. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.